Great.
Right now. So, hello everyone. My name is Allison Daigle. I'm the director of the Autism Alliance and the moderator of this evening's guest speaker. I'm joined this evening by my colleague Katie Cassavant, autism specialist. She's going to give you a wave. We will be recording tonight's presentation. You may have your video on or off during the presentation. Please stay on mute when not speaking. We will take questions throughout the presentation. Thank you, Megan, for offering that. This program is scheduled from 6:30 to 7:30. We want to make this as helpful for all of you. We're so excited to have Megan here this evening. She's now I present Megan. She's a speech language pathologist, Megan Romanczyk, from the Boston Ability Center, who will be speaking tonight about the learning differences between analytic and gestalt learning development. This talk will explore developmental milestones, assessment and treatment, and best practices, and so much more. I hope you will enjoy this evening, and I will now turn it over to you, Megan.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, everyone. I'll go ahead and share my screen and we can jump right in. Perfect. Fantastic. Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking about what is Gestalt language processing. Before we begin, just a little bit about me. I'm a speech language pathologist. I graduated from Northeastern in 2020. I started my clinical fellowship, which is kind of the internship year you do when you begin as a speech language pathologist, at a facility called the Boston Ability Center in July 2020. And I'm really passionate about supporting children who are autistic. And so I've completed a lot of trainings in that area. So DIR floor time, the Learn, Play, Thrive strengths-based approach to autism, and the Meaningful Speech Natural Language Acquisition course, where I learned so much wonderful information about Gestalt language processing. My clinical interests include neurodiversity, affirming, language and social intervention, augmentative and alternative communication, selective mutism, and stuttering. And a little bit about where I work. So the Boston Ability Center is a pediatric outpatient center located in Natick and Wellesley, Massachusetts. We see pretty much all age range from birth to 18. So it's pediatrics. We have physical therapy, occupational therapy, speech, feeding, group therapies, and great inclusive community events. We focus on play-centered, family-oriented, interdisciplinary, and neurodiversity affirming care. So it's a great place. And it's super fun to work there. There's a zip line, a ball pit, therapeutic swings, outdoor spaces, and a therapy dog. So it's fun for the kids and for the clinicians. Tonight, I want to talk about the two distinct pathways for communication development. And then we're going to dive in deeper to one of those pathways, which is known as Gestalt language processing. We're going to talk about how a speech language pathologist assesses and treats an individual who presents as a Gestalt language processor. And finally, we'll share lots of strategies and resources so you can support any Gestalt language processors you have at home. So let's begin with two paths to language development. Analytic language processing is one path to language development that for kind of the majority of sort of like academia was presented as the only path to language development. And it looked like this. So a kid around 1 year old starts to use one word. Around 18 months, they start to maybe combine two words. Around 24 months, they're using lots of two-word phrases. And they have a big vocabulary that's growing to almost 200 to 300 words. And by 3 years old, that vocabulary explodes and comes up to 1,000 words, three-word utterances. And so individuals who are analytic language processors develop language in this very predictable pattern. At 1 year, they have one word. 2 years, they have two words. 3 years, they have three-word utterances. So a 12-month-old might say mama. And then maybe at 24 months, they say, mama, help. And then at 36 months, they say, mama, help me. So it's this very linear, predictable pattern, and that's analytic language processing. Similarly, their language comprehension follows this very linear, predictable pattern. Around 3 to 6 months, they're starting to gain an awareness, looking towards sounds, watching speakers' faces. From 6 to 12 months, they're starting to respond to their name and familiar requests and understanding common words. And, in this very predictable pattern, with each month that goes by, they're gaining more comprehension skills. So between 1 to 2 years, they're starting to follow 1 to 2 step simple directions and understand simple questions and action words. Around 3 to 4 years, their language becomes much more nuanced, and they can attend to their name being called from another room and understand WH questions. So like, who did that, or where are they going? And then around 4 to 5 years, their understanding becomes a lot more nuanced, and they can answer questions kind of about a story, like, why did Curious George do that, do you think? And follow directions regarding objects out of sight, like, hey, can you go up to your room and like get your homework and come downstairs? So again, for analytic language processors, it's kind of this linear process where expression and comprehension are growing at the same time, kind of each component building off of each other. And for the longest time, this is all that was taught in graduate school. So if you studied linguistics or speech pathology or child development, this is kind of all you learned about. Similarly, just as what a child can say and what they can understand grows in this linear pattern, so does how they say it. So articulation is kind of the way we speak, our speech sounds. So around 1 year, a kid is about like understood 25% of the time. So if you've ever listened to a 1-year-old talk, there's a lot of babbling, there's a few single words, and you can only understand about 25% of what they say. Around 2 years, that bumps up to about 50% of what they say. So if they're using lots of 2-word phrases, you might understand about half. Around 3 years, that bumps up to around 75%. And by 4 years old, kids' speech tends to be pretty clear. So again, for analytic language processors, the language that they express, how they say what they say, and the language that they comprehend tends to follow this very predictable developmental pattern, each block building on the previous, and it kind of all coming together simultaneously. So if a child is an analytic language processor, there's some really wonderful strategies that are very effective for these kids. So for example, if a child has delays with expressive language and they're an analytic language processor, it can be helpful to use some strategies like these. So the +1 word strategy is where you take what your kid is saying and you add a word. So maybe like you have a 1-year-old and they say ball, and you say like, hi ball, push ball, roll ball. So you're modeling kind of one additional word to help them expand their vocabulary. Thematic vocabulary is basically where you try to incorporate a lot of language in the same theme to kind of enrich sort of the connections that the child is making. So, if you're playing with a farm, you have the farm and the farm animals. Maybe you're reading a story about the farm later in the day. Maybe you have like little farm animal toys that you're playing with later in the day or later that week. And so you're kind of giving repeated exposure to language in that theme. Playful obstructions is a strategy where you encourage the use of language through creating opportunities to communicate. So for example, maybe a child's favorite toy is out of reach, and so they have to point to it and say ball or help mama or help dada to be able to get that object. Verbal routines and expectant pauses is when you say ready, set, go, and you're creating that opportunity for the child to sort of fill in what comes next. And they're getting repeated exposure to this predictable language. And then visual support. So kind of having visual representations of the language that you're using. If you've had a child who is in early intervention, you're probably familiar with all of these. And these are strategies that work fantastically if you are an analytic language processor. Similarly, for receptive language, some strategies that can be really effective include using visual supports, using a slowed rate and simplified language, and breaking down directions into smaller steps using gesture cues. So instead of saying like, hey, can you get your shoes on and then get your backpack and then, go upstairs and get your homework and then bring it downstairs, you kind of slow it down, take it one step at a time, and maybe point to what you're referring to. And so just to summarize, analytic language processors are individuals who kind of build up language sort of one word at a time in this predictable pattern. And these are some strategies that really are helpful for them. So analytic language processing is considered kind of bottom-up language acquisition. So kind of thinking like, a tree grows, like there's the roots and then the tree and then the branches, and it kind of is building one step at a time. So for analytic language processors, they vocalize first, and then they babble. And then around 1 year, they start to use single words. Then around 2 to 3 years, they start to use short phrases. And finally, they use sentences. And kids, even if they are delayed, will kind of follow this pattern. Research suggests that the vast majority of children are analytic language processors. And that's why education has had a bias towards only teaching this type of language processing for years and years and years. Analytic language processors can have language delays, and so they'll benefit from therapy that's focused on building their vocabulary, their grammar, their sentence structure skills, because that's how they're processing language, and that serves them well. So now, just for fun, we can see a couple of examples of what that looks like. I'm just going to reshare to make sure I have my sound. Perfect. Okay, cool.
I'd say, that's usually their first. Oh my gosh, that's usually their first. Indy. Baby.
So that's an example of an analytic language processor who, two analytic language processors who are using their first words. So they kind of learned these individual words, they understand what they mean, and now they're using them. And then these kids will progress and be able to start putting together short phrases and sentences like this kid.
How old is Daddy?
Daddy, 4.
Okay. Who is the president?
I am.
Okay. Would you like a baby sister?
No.
Okay. What do you like to do for fun?
I want to play my toys.
Okay. How tall is Daddy?
Big.
Okay. How much does Mommy love you?
You must.
Oh, okay.
So cute. So that's an analytic language processor, and some things to note that are going to distinguish this processing style from others is how this child was kind of processing the question and able to answer the question and kind of putting one word together at a time. So, you know, he was able to say, no, I love you this much. Daddy is big. And so he was kind of in his mind being able to construct these sentences sort of from scratch, from these building blocks. And that's going to be different from Gestalt language processing, which is the reason why we're all here today. So Gestalt language processing is a different way of processing language. All language acquisition starts with units of language. So for those analytic language processors that we just saw, those units are words. So if a child is communicating something, you know, when they were 1 year old, they learned the word dada. When they were 2 years old, they started to learn more words, and now they have dada help. And then by the time they're 6 years old, they can say, hey, dada, can you help me with my homework? You know, they got one word at a time, and eventually were able to build to construct new meaning from all of these words together. This differs from Gestalt language processors. For Gestalt language processors, the unit of language is not words. It's actually something called gestalts, which I'll talk about what that means. So a gestalt is an intonationally defined unit of language. When I say intonation, I basically mean kind of the rhythm of speech. So when you say, hey versus hey, that's intonation. So it's changing the way you say your phrase. So, you know, if you have kids at home, or, you know, if your kids, when you remember when they were younger and they watched TV, you probably heard a lot of rich intonation. Like if you're watching Paw Patrol, they say Chase is on the case, and they often have very rich intonation, and Gestalt language processors often pick up on that. So a gestalt is an intonationally defined unit of language that can be long or short. It's likely picked up due to a dramatic or emotional experience, and it represents a unit of meaning that includes that experience. It's most often not literal. For decades and decades and decades, Gestalt language was just described as echolalia. So basically, if someone is using delayed echolalia, that's indicative that they are a Gestalt language processor. So they basically processed a chunk of language and use it later, kind of out of context, but to them, the meaning remains true. So I'll give an example just to kind of express sort of my first time encountering this. And I was working with a child, and I pulled out like a language assessment tool to do with him. And he really didn't want to do it. And he became upset and he said, no, it's too spicy. And I was very confused. And his mom was in the room and she said, oh, my child says it's too spicy when he doesn't want to do something. And I had never heard of this before. So I said, why? And she said, well, like 2 years ago, he tried this really spicy Indian food for the first time and he really didn't like it. And, he was getting all red and tearing up. And so mom took the plate away and said, it's too spicy. And so to him, in that dramatic emotional experience, he learned it's too spicy means no. And so for years and years, he used that gestalt, that delayed echolalia, to convey, no, I don't like it. And so he would be playing in the park and not want to play on the swing, and he'd say, it's too spicy. So the individual words, it's, too, and spicy didn't maintain their meaning. Instead, the whole gestalt phrase, it's too spicy, was able to convey his intention. Here are some examples of gestalts that I have heard in my life. So a kid saying, Chase is on the case, using that delayed echolalia from Paw Patrol to convey, like, I want to play. Put your shoes on. I've heard that gestalt as an indicator for a child being ready to transition, because they always hear their parents say, put your shoes on whenever it's time to go. Okay, let's go. A child indicating that they're ready because that's what their clinician says every time they walk them from the waiting room to their therapy session. At this point, I'm curious if anyone has any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself or pop in the chat. And I don't know if I can see in the chat. Oh, I'll just pause for a moment to give anyone a second if they would like to. Awesome. Okay, cool. We'll go on. So in contrast to analytic language processing, Gestalt language processing is a top-down process. And so basically, instead of building language up one word at a time, instead they start with the whole chunk of language and eventually break it down. So they start with a large chunk of language that's used as a unit that holds a larger meaning. Gestalt language processors are those individuals who have been described as using delayed echolalia or scripting, because that language they're using is kind of gestalt. It's these meaningful chunks of language that they're using to convey whatever they want to convey. And children will communicate using word for word repetitions of what others have said, or lines from movies, shows, virtual games, videos, or songs. So a lot of times Gestalt language processors, people will recognize, like, oh, that's a line from Bluey, or that's a line from Wizard of Oz, but it doesn't just have to be from media. A lot of times these individuals will also use language that they've heard from their teachers or their classmates or their parents. So it's basically, the individual was in a situation where, they're experiencing something and they want to be able to convey that same experience that they had before. And so they said, well, last time I didn't like something, someone around me said it's too spicy. So now I'm going to use the language, it's too spicy, to be able to convey. And I should say, it's not an intentional choice, because it's challenging. A lot of people who have Gestalt, who are Gestalt language processors and communicate using echolalia, there's a lot of communication breakdowns because that's not how the majority of people communicate. It just speaks to how their brain is processing that language. Gestalt language processing is a difference, not an inherent disorder. So not every Gestalt language processor needs therapy. As with analytic language processing, therapy is only warranted if the child demonstrates difficulty effectively communicating with other people. So I've met Gestalt language processors who, they're really young and they're kind of still moving through the developmental stages. They're communicating effectively. And I don't necessarily think that they'll need therapy, versus, if I get like a 5 or 6-year-old who's still only primarily communicating with echolalia, well, that makes it more challenging for them to be understood by others. And so I would recommend therapy in that case. And we'll get into some more examples of that. How do you know if a kid is a Gestalt language processor? There are situations where it's really obvious, but then there's situations where it might be more nuanced. So here's some things to look for. Gestalt language processors may repeat previously heard language word for word to communicate. They may use language that may appear out of context. So I have a little girl right now who every time she gets mad, she says, "Don't squeeze it," which is very out of context. And then in talking to their family, they shared that, one time she got really, really mad and she was kind of playing sort of rough with the family pet. And the dad said, "Oh, don't squeeze it, don't squeeze it." And so now she associates that language with that situation in which she was feeling really mad. And so now when she's mad, she says, "Don't squeeze it." Gestalt language processors have a strong memory for books and songs, but difficulty communicating needs. They very frequently will reverse pronouns. So kids will say like, "You want a snack," when they actually mean, "I'm hungry, I want a snack." The reason for this is because, these individuals are not yet identifying like the meaning of "you" versus "I," that these are pronouns and the meaning changes depending on who's talking. Instead, they're just holding that entire chunk of language. So if every time they sit down at the lunch table and their teacher says, "Oh, you want a snack?" Now the whole phrase, "You want a snack," means like that experience of having a snack together. And then Gestalt language processors often have difficulty answering questions because they're not yet processing like the individual words within the question. They'll instead repeat all or part of the question instead of saying yes or no. And then again, just to reiterate, Gestalt language processing is a different way of cognitively processing. It's not indicative of, like a cognitive delay or cognitive challenge. So just because someone has difficulty answering a question, it doesn't mean that, they're not a smart person and they don't have intelligence. It's just a different way of processing. And so we can accommodate and figure out how to present that information better. And we can work on them therapeutically to support them in like eventually, being able to break down that language and sort of figure that out from a language processing sense. Gestalt language processors may study and replay favorite media clips repeatedly. So I've worked with Gestalt language processors that their speech isn't very clear. And so even though they have a lot of gestalts that they want to share, they may not be able to say them. And so they'll instead like replay the media clip to indicate what they want to communicate. Gestalt language processors may use very rich intonation. So again, that's kind of the melody of speech, but their words may be very unclear. A lot of speech therapists will describe this as jargon. So it kind of sounds like da 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 da. So, the words aren't clear, but there's very rich prosody. And it kind of sounds like this kid is having, like a full conversation. You can hear jargon across different language processing styles, but if a kid is using jargon for a very prolonged period of time, it may be indicative that they are a Gestalt language processor and may need that type of support. And Gestalt language processors may also inconsistently use some single words, but have difficulty putting those words together. And that's because the individual isn't yet kind of isolating that word to understand its meaning, that water bottle means water bottle and phone means phone. It still is kind of stuck as this chunk that stands for a broader meaning. And so, I've worked with kids in the past that, they do have a couple of single words, but they can't put those words together. They can't say like, get water bottle, need water bottle. And those words are kind of stuck in like a very specific context. And that's indicative to me that that individual is a Gestalt language processor. Okay, so some examples.
Oh no! Oh no! Oh no, Shaky! Oh no! Wait, Shaky is home! Now it's happened!
What happened?
Happened.
Oh no.
Oh no.
So that's a situation in which it sounds like the child was watching a show in which like a character said, "Oh no, what happened?" And so they're kind of repeating that phrase over and over, not necessarily in the sense that the child is literally asking their mom, like, "Oh no, what happened?" But instead they're using that delayed echo to kind of represent something that media clip meant to them. Here's another example.
Huh?
Okay, what did I watch?
Okay, what do you want to watch?
Crack cars.
You want to watch Clever Cars.
Yes.
I want to watch Clever Cars.
Okay.
So this is a great example of a kid who is a Gestalt language processor and is kind of using a combination of different language. So often Gestalt language processors aren't exclusively using echolalia, like they might be kind of progressing and starting to learn like slowly how to answer questions and how to put words together. But that first thing that kid said, he said, okay, what do you want to watch? It seems to me that that's kind of what his parents ask him whenever it's time to watch TV together. Like, okay, what do you want to watch? And so this boy didn't literally mean, Mom, what do you want to watch? He meant like, I want to watch Clever Cars, and this is how I'm going to convey it to you because that's the language that I have processed. Awesome. Okay, great. I'll just check in on the chat. Everyone's good, amazing. Feel free to pop things into the chat throughout if you have any questions, but I should save some time at the end as well. Okay, so Gestalt language processors, just like analytic language processors, will move through developmental stages. For Gestalt language processors, that development starts with echolalia, but it will progress towards kind of the same language that everyone eventually uses, which is sort of this flexible, self-generated language. For some people, it's very quick. For some people, it takes years and years. And for some people, you know, they'll primarily communicate somewhere along the spectrum. So they might not be using a ton of flexible, self-generated language and grammar in their life. They might fall somewhere along here. So basically, Gestalt language processors start by using echolalia. So that's that kind of delayed repetition of language that they've heard previously. Then they'll move towards mitigating that echolalia. Mitigation basically means taking that whole chunk and breaking it down to fit the context. And then I'll give some examples so you can see what I mean by this. Then Gestalt language processors will be able to isolate words from the original Gestalt. So when a kid said, it's too spicy, that's the point at which they understand, oh, spicy means there's peppers in it, it's hot. So it's too spicy no longer has this whole big meaning of no. Now they're kind of isolating the individual words and saying, oh, that's what that means. And from there, they can then build the language back up and be able to use flexible, self-generated language. While kids typically will move from kind of one stage to the next, it's very common for kids to have language kind of across different levels. So it's not that a kid is only using echolalia, then they're only using mitigations. More so it might be that the kid is mostly using echolalia, but you're hearing some mitigations, or they're mostly mitigating, but you're hearing some single words. So it's very common for kids to have language sort of across these developmental stages, and your speech therapist will be able to help kind of determine, you know, like where are they and what's the vision for the future. And I'll show you some examples of what that looks like. So stage one echolalia might look like this is the language a child is using. So they say, oh, McDonald had a farm. It's too spicy. Oh no, what happened? Hey, stop that. So they're only using kind of delayed echoes of language previously heard. The first example is I had a child who really loved playing with like little toy cows, and she would always sing Old MacDonald Had a Farm to request playing with the little cows because, you know, she associated that song with the cows. At stage two, the individuals start to break that language down. So maybe they can say, let's play Old MacDonald, or, oh no, stop that. So they're kind of taking pieces from the different gestalts and putting them together or breaking them down. At stage three, they start to isolate single words, and they might be able to use some like early word combinations. So that's mostly nouns and adjectives. So farm, red farm, pig farm. So they're starting, this is kind of the stage where a kid can point to things and say like, oh, wall, chair, table, me, you. So they're starting to isolate those kind of like individual concepts. And then at stage four, kids start to put all of this together to convey their own unique ideas. So like play farm, dad, get big farm, no want farm. And it's typically at this stage not grammatically correct, but that's okay. because that's sort of developmentally expected. If you've ever heard a 3-year-old talk, like there's no grammar, but it's okay. It sounds like, no, want to do that. And that makes sense. It's kind of learning how to put the words together and then eventually refining that language. So at stage 1, Gestalt language processors repeat language from their environment word for word. This may sound like long strings of less intelligible speech with rich intonation, also known as jargon. So, you can't understand what they're saying, but it's very clear that they know what they're saying, and it sounds like the rhythm of conversation. They may repeat lines from favorite media, repeat language from family, teachers, and friends, use language that appears out of context, or use single words, but those single words are kind of stuck. They're not really using those single words in a super functional way. Children are not yet making the connection at this stage that individual words have a unique meaning. Instead, gestalts often represent an entire experience or emotion. Children may not yet understand the purpose of questions, as evidenced by repeating the questions verbatim, and children will often confuse first person and third person pronouns. When children get stuck in stage 1, therapy is warranted to support more effective communication. I should say too, I'm a pediatric therapist, so I say children, but adults can be in stage 1 too. This doesn't apply just to children. It's anyone who processes language this way. At stage 2, Gestalt language processors begin to learn how to modify their language to alter the meaning and make it more contextually appropriate. So this may sound like combining 2 gestalts. So come on, everybody, plus we need to go, might sound like, come on, we need to go. Modifying a gestalt to fit the communication context. This is an example from my session with a little girl who loved Peppa Pig, and she'd say in the British accent, I love jumping in muddy puddles. And so we would go around the gym and try out different activities, and we would say, I love jumping trampoline, or I love jumping on the floor. And so we would kind of take that original gestalt and sort of like modify it to fit the context. Or shortening a longer gestalt. So I have a kid who, whenever he's angry, he will use the song from Daniel Tiger to express like, when you feel so mad that you want to roar. And so we're working on shortening that to like, just feel so mad. So we're kind of taking that longer gestalt and we're shortening it. So these are all different ways that a child may mitigate. Some children and people do this naturally. Others benefit from therapy to support them in progressing. At stage 3, Gestalt language processors start to learn that individual words have meaning. And so while it may seem like a step back, it's necessary for these children to start isolating those single words so that they may progress towards more flexible, self-generated language. So this may sound like a kid is just walking around the house going, car, big TV, that house, yellow, red apple. It very much mirrors in typical analytic language development that like 1 to 2 year mark where you're starting to use one word and single word combinations. Great. Okay. And then at stage 4, this is where individuals begin to use beginning grammar. So Gestalt language processors start to combine words in unique ways to communicate their message. Grammatical errors are a common and necessary step in development because it really shows that an individual isn't repeating the language verbatim. They're really thinking about like, how do I convey this? So some examples that I've heard before are like, not go home, I search it, we no need it, I go swing. And so, it's very distinctly not grammatical, but that's okay because everyone can understand what they mean. And over time, this language will become more refined. So I've worked with children who are here and then eventually get here. So beyond stage 4 is where Gestalt language processors begin independently using flexible grammar and continue to develop their grammar, sentence structure, and vocabulary skills. So they can convey, nuanced concepts like, okay, I'm ready to go now. Mom, do you know where my shoes are? I want to order a chocolate milkshake. And so, it's grammatical, like it's contextually appropriate. And there's kind of more, like higher level vocabulary. And so again, to just reiterate, the kids will generally move through these stages either independently or with therapy, but it's not everyone moves at their own pace. And so there may be some people that, are in therapy for years and years and are more so kind of in that stage one area for a while. And that's okay. That's okay, because the most important thing is that, the people in their life are seeking to understand how they're communicating, how they're processing, and really making, their voice and their message be heard. So when a speech language pathologist meets a Gestalt language processor, there are some best practices for assessment. Because Gestalt language processors process language differently than analytic language processors, and because they move through different developmental stages than Gestalt language or than analytic language processors, they benefit from distinct assessment tools. So using the same type of assessment tools for two individuals who process language so differently doesn't make sense. And because because pretty much every language assessment tool has been developed with the sole vision of an analytic language processor in mind, they're just not appropriate. So the gold standard for Gestalt language processing is to take a language sample, because you want to figure out the individual's developmental stage. So basically, are they using mostly echolalia, mitigation, single words? You also want to figure out how they're using communication, because really the primary goal of an individual going to, speech therapy or kind of working with their family or other kind of therapists is to be understood. And so you want to help them not only kind of like grow their vocabulary, but also be able to use language in so many different functional ways. So, to reject things, to protest, to share how they're feeling, to ask for a transition, to seek clarification. And so we want to see kind of like, where are they developmentally, but also how are they using language? And finally, therapists want to write goals to support the child in, progressing toward the next developmental stage and increasing their use of language for a variety of intentions. So language samples help with this, because you basically take a child or an individual and see, what language are they using naturally. So you can document kind of all of their gestalts, whether or not they're mitigating those gestalts, if you're starting to hear any stage 3 or 4 language. And ideally, this language sample would be collected across different environments. So, a speech therapist might work with an individual in the clinic or in their home, and they might ask the family to jot down a few things that the kid says throughout the day. Maybe they ask the teacher to jot down a few things they say throughout the day, just to get a really well-rounded picture of how is this child communicating across settings. And finally, it's really helpful to discuss the language samples with anyone in the child's life who might be able to kind of understand where that language came from. So, with caregivers, with teachers, even with their siblings, if they have older siblings, to determine kind of where did these gestalts come from and what is the meaning. So this is what a write-up of kind of a language sample might look like. So I assessed this girl a few years ago, and she was using all of this language, so sticky, you can go down the stairs, here you go. And then through talking with her family, I was able to recognize what language is kind of out of context, direct echoes from previously heard language. And that's how I kind of know that's stage 1. Those are gestalts. So for example, this child would say, it needs new batteries every time she wanted to get like a new toy. And I asked, where did that language come from? And she said, oh, it came from her birthday. Like for her birthday, she was getting new toys. And the dad would say like, oh, it needs new batteries, because it was brand new and they needed to put batteries in. And so she processed that language for like, oh, I'm getting all this new stuff. It needs new batteries. That means like get new toys. So I thought that was kind of interesting, and sort of speaks to the importance of that collaboration for Gestalt language processors, because without discussing with them, I wouldn't have any idea what that language meant. Fantastic. Okay. So for the kind of remainder of our time together, I'm hoping that you'll leave with some practical strategies for, if I have a child who's a Gestalt language processor, if I'm working with a Gestalt language processor, how can I support them? So the natural language acquisition approach was developed by a speech language pathologist named Marge Blanc to support Gestalt language processors in developing more effective communication skills. This approach is evidence-based, rooted in case studies and self-reports by Gestalt language processors. It's a very child-led and play-based approach, or leisure-based for older individuals, and it's individualized to each person's language processing style and where they are developmentally. So here are kind of some of the principles that I've taken from the natural language acquisition approach. If an individual is using stage 1 language, but they're only using a very limited number of gestalts. So they say a few phrases kind of in specific contexts, but they're having a hard time communicating. The best thing to do is determine the communication intentions that the individual is not yet using and model gestalts to support meeting those communication needs. So as a parent, you can kind of notice the situations in your child's life where they're having a hard time communicating and model language that they may be able to use in those situations. So maybe they're reaching for something and you say, oh, need some help, let's get help. And you're kind of modeling those phrases that maybe they'll be able to pick up and use in the future. If you notice that your child gets really dysregulated during times of transitions, you might be able to say, let's do something different. And you give them language to share, like, I'm ready to move on. Or expressing feelings, like you notice your child is sick and you model, oh, I don't feel so good. So kind of what's different about this is instead of asking the individual, what do you need? You're kind of giving voice to what you're noticing so that they can then reflect that language back in the future. If an individual is primarily using stage 1 language and they're using a very wide variety of gestalts, so they're communicating pretty effectively by having gestalts to request help and ask for more and let you know when they're all done, express how they're feeling, they're really communicating effectively. The goal then is to help them learn how to mitigate those gestalts. So for a child who says, it's so spicy, we might go around and notice things around the house and say, ooh, it's so soft, it's so fun, it's so silly. So we're taking that original gestalt and breaking it down. For an individual who says, come on, mama, anytime they want to go somewhere, whether or not mom is involved, you break it down. You say, come on, dad, come on, everyone, come on. So you're kind of just changing that gestalt a little bit to fit the context. Look at that might be changed to look at that car. Look at that, mama, so cool. Yeah, so basically mitigating just means break it down, change it a little bit. And whenever possible, kind of keep that original intonation so that it still holds that kind of original source, emotional meaning for the child. If a child is primarily using stage 1 language, but you can't understand what they're saying, so you hear really consistent, they're like, ba-da-da, and you're like, I don't know what they're saying, but twice a day they say ba-da-da, and it probably means something. It can be helpful to kind of reflect back, like, okay, where might that language have come from? Does that sound like something I heard in a show? Does that sound like something like their sibling said before? And if so, you can model the language that you think the child is using. So maybe ba-da-da means like, let's do it or something. And you might kind of try it out and, is this right? And you reflect that language back a few times and you see. It can also be helpful to just continue modeling gestalts for a variety of communication intentions. So even if you're not understanding what your child is saying to you yet, you keep trying and you keep, modeling like, let's do it. It's so fun. Come on. Oh, I don't like that. So you're just, filling your child's day with lots of examples of rich language, knowing that over time, that expression will grow. And finally, if a child is really consistently not easily understood by others, considering augmentative and alternative communication. So that's like speech generating devices where an individual can hit an icon to express what they need or what they're thinking. Okay, if a child's primarily using stage 2 language, you can continue to reflect back the child's language and model additional mitigation, so additional ways of breaking down that language. You can also begin to model single words to help that individual progress towards stage 3. Focusing on nouns and adjectives is really helpful because basically those are the things you can point to, like bottle, blue bottle, big bottle. So sometimes families feel hesitant, like, oh, my kid is saying so much, why would I use less language? And the goal isn't about kind of the quantity of the language, but the quality. It's helpful to help individuals make the connection that each word has an individual meaning because only through that understanding can an individual then, express anything that they want to say, because they now have all the building blocks for language. And then if an individual is primarily using stage 3 language, you want to reflect back single words that the child is using and model additional single words and word combinations. At this stage, we're not yet modeling grammar because we want children to make the connection independently of how to build meaning from putting words together. So if they say car and then we say drive the car, that didn't come from them, and they're not sort of yet processing kind of like the individual meaning of drive and car. We really want to kind of support them in processing that on their own, because we run the risk of, if they say car and we say, yeah, drive the car, they might pick up on that drive the car as like a whole gestalt rather than the individual meanings. So we kind of want to meet them where they are in their grammatical development. And then finally, if an individual is primarily using stage 4, we want to reflect back the phrases that the child is using. We don't want to immediately start correcting grammar. Instead, we just want to be promoting different situations in which they're combining words in different ways. And over time, when they're really firmly in stage 4 and they're using language in lots of different creative ways, that's when we can say, like, okay, let's reassess this child's language and let's start working on kind of expanding their vocabulary and their grammar. So once a child is consistently using a variety of stage 4 utterances for a variety of communication intentions, we can really do anything. So we can reassess the child's language to determine language targets, if continued intervention is needed to support successful communication. So those are all of those speechy terms like morphology, syntax, vocabulary. And so this is the stage where you can kind of dive deeper and figure out, what will help this individual continue to progress and be able to use language in more nuanced ways. Fantastic. Okay, so hopefully at this point you have a good understanding of what Gestalt language processing is and sort of evidence-based strategies for assessment and treatment that can kind of give you some ideas of how an individual progresses. And finally, I want to close with how can you carry over some of these things that we've learned about Gestalt language processing into strategies that you can use at home. So the first one is just knowing that gestalts aren't literal. So the worst thing that, like a therapist could do is if a kid comes in and says, it's too spicy, is say, no, it's not, because you're basically saying, like, I don't understand you, like your language isn't making sense right now, because what we know is that gestalts are meaningful. Even though they're not literal, they're very meaningful to the individual, and it's their best way of communicating right now. And so we want to acknowledge what we hear, even when, even if we don't quite know what they mean yet. So we want to focus on the communication intention rather than the literal words. So if a child is pushing a toy away and saying, it's too spicy, we can say, oh, I think it's too spicy means no. And we can say, yeah, it's too spicy. Don't like that. No, thanks. And so that kind of goes hand in hand with sort of being a detective. So if an individual uses a Gestalt phrase often, we can check in with family members, teachers, or therapists to see whether we can find out where the Gestalt came from. By understanding the source, we can often understand the meaning. So in that case of the child who says, don't squeeze it, I probably never would have figured out what that meant. I knew it was associated with anger and protesting, but only through understanding the kind of original memory of that Gestalt was I able to understand like fully what it meant and how they were using it. Keeping a journal can be really helpful. I can't keep track of pieces of paper to save my life, so my journal is just my phone. I'll have on the Notes app, just like kind of keeping track, and then maybe I upload it to a Google Drive or a sticky note, whatever system is helpful for you. But basically just keeping track of like, what did my kids say and where did it come from and what does that mean? Just so everyone on the child's team can be on the same page. I have a lot of families where we have like a shared Google document. So they're kind of uploading language that they heard their kids say along with me, their private SLP, and maybe their school SLP and their teacher. So we're all sort of collaborating and helping to figure out like, what is this child saying and why, and how can we help them progress? So for example, with my little kid who said, I like to jump in muddy puddles, I knew that was from Peppa Pig, so I was able to kind of infer that this meant like, oh, this is fun, let's do more of this based on that episode. A child might use a gestalt. This was an example that someone shared from, like, they were a teacher and the child would repeatedly say like, mama's right here, mama's right here. And the teacher shared like, oh, they were reassuring the child on the first day of school, like mom was dropping them off and the kids started to cry. And the teacher said, mama's right here, don't worry, mama's right here. And so we can infer from that, that child in that moment was feeling really scared and seeking reassurance. And so they use that gestalt in moments where they're feeling scared and seeking reassurance. Limiting questions is, I think, a really great strategy. If you only leave with kind of like one thing from this presentation, this is a really helpful one. So Gestalt language processors often have difficulty understanding and answering questions, but we can still give choices just by phrasing our words differently. So instead of saying, do you want to go to the gym? We might say, let's go to the gym, or nah, I don't want to. So it's a subtle shift, but instead of phrasing it as a question, you're phrasing it as a statement, but still providing the choice. So a lot of times my kids might come into the gym and they might be kind of dysregulated. And I might say like, instead of saying, do you need a bathroom break? I might say, need to go to the bathroom, or I don't need to. And so they can kind of pick from those choices because these Gestalt language processors are processing the whole chunk of language. It's sometimes helpful to like give them that chunk and then they can reflect it back rather than having to like deconstruct the question and like flip it. And acknowledge what you hear. So even if you don't know what a Gestalt language processor is trying to say, you can validate their communication attempt by repeating back what you heard or saying something like, I hear you. So I had a little kid that I met him for the first time, and he said like, I'll change the sister's name, but he would say like, Mary's watching CoComelon, Mary's watching CoComelon. And he would say that over and over and over. And I didn't know what he meant. So I would say, I hear you. Yeah, Mary's watching CoComelon. Thanks for telling me. And eventually over time, I figured out like that was his kind of asking like, when am I going to see my sister again? Like, when is the session over? And when am I going to see my sister? He was kind of seeking that reassurance. And, I didn't know that yet. But what I could do at the time was just let him know that his words were meaningful to me, and I could be there with him and saying, yes, I do hear what you're saying. Following the child or the individual's adult's lead is a really great strategy for Gestalt language processors because learning happens through engagement and connection. So, rather than sitting at a table and saying, this is what we're going to do today, kind of watching and observing what is this person naturally drawn to, and then modeling language in those contexts. So I have some kids who really love cleaning products and that's their special interest. And so, very safely, like using spray bottles that are filled with water, things like that, not actually using cleaning solution, but we'll play games where the child is kind of like spraying different things and pretending to clean them up or using a kid vacuum. And his language really flourishes in those moments because it's what he's motivated by. And when I model language in the context of those situations, it really makes sense to him and it's meaningful to him. And then he'll use it again in different contexts. Whereas, if we were sitting at a table and it was this very decontextualized worksheet, for example, that's not as meaningful and that language won't really generalize. And the distinction between modeling and prompting is really helpful. So when we model language for Gestalt language processors, we're using language in natural contexts with the knowledge that the Gestalt language processor picks up on chunks of meaningful language rather than taught words or phrases. So instead of saying, tell me I want a cookie, we model, let's get a cookie. Instead of saying, you can say, I need help. Instead, we model, I need some help. Instead of saying, okay, say all done, we might say, I don't like that, stop that, that's all done. Instead of asking, what's this called? We might say, hey, look at that, that's an apple. Instead of requesting that the child label and say, it's an apple, say apple. we can kind of comment on the experience. It's so yummy. Let's get more apples. I like apples. So the difference between prompting and modeling is basically that we're using language in natural context in a way that Gestalt language processors can pick up on rather than be explicitly taught, and therefore not be able to generalize or use in a natural way. Finally, we want to model a variety of language. So we don't want to just follow our kid around all day saying, need some help, need some help. How about now, need some help? Which definitely I feel like I've been guilty of in the past, like focused on kind of laser focused on one goal. Like, oh, I really want this kid to get like to start asking for help because it's so functional and so important. But we use language in so many different ways all day, and all of those ways of using language are equally important. So it's really helpful when we're kind of playing with our kid or hanging out with our adult who's a Gestalt language processor, using language in a variety of ways, a variety of meaningful ways. So commenting, directing attention, requesting, expressing what we like and don't like are all equally valid ways of communicating. And so we want to make sure we're using all of that language. Great. I'll just go through this very quickly. If you work with someone or if you have a child who has an AAC system, you can customize the device so it works better for their Gestalt language processing style. So some principles there are programming original audio or video or recorded speech for Gestalts. So that might be you take a clip from YouTube that you know your child like uses that language a lot and you program that straight into the device. Programming Gestalts based on communication intention. So that means, you know, if a child says it's so spicy and that means no, that's kind of where you put it on the device. Maintaining the motor plan just means once you program something, you leave it there. So it's easy for the child to find. And then finally, you know, giving the child what they need now, but having a vision for the future. And that vision for the future is eventually this child will start to use single words, start to use grammar. And so we're not deleting any words, we're just adding more to help them where they are now. If this is something that people are interested in diving in deeper, I'd definitely be happy to chat, but I think that's all we have time for right now. Okay, if this is something that's super interesting to you and you want to learn more, there's some great resources. I think I'll share the slides at the end so you can have these links, but there's some wonderful blogs, trainings. There's some really great Facebook groups that include kind of parents and therapists and Gestalt language processors all sort of collaborating together, and some great Instagram accounts for those of you who like sort of micro learning, and some podcasts and books. And thank you, right on the dot. Oh my gosh, I really appreciate your time. Thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you, Megan. So incredibly insightful and some really great examples. Thank you very, very much. Does anybody have any questions at all?
I have a question. Thank you. I really, really love the presentation. I know you mentioned like for analytic language processors, it's often good to kind of have them fill in the blank, like ready, set, go. How would you use that strategy with Gestalt language processors, and if so, at what stage?
Yeah, great question. So I usually don't. Typically, when I'm picking the language that I'm going to model for Gestalt language processors, I'm thinking of what is, like I say, mitigable. So I have a vision for it. Like if they're going to kind of use this echolalia, what is easier to break down in the future? What is going to be more meaningful? And so Gestalt language processors will naturally pick up language from anywhere. And so maybe they have a Gestalt that's ready, set, go. But in my therapy session, I want to be a little bit more intentional about like, it's time to go. Let's go, everyone, because then that's a little bit easier to break down and say, let's go to the gym. Let's go outside versus ready, set, go. So yeah, I hope that answers your question. Does that kind of make sense?
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And then in terms of the AAC, is there a certain app or program that would be best for Gestalt language learners?
Yeah. This is personal preference based on my own experience, but I think the more features an app has that allows for programming of video, audio, or recorded speech, the better for Gestalt language processors. So touch chat is really great for that because you can program original video clips like right into sort of the communication device.
Okay.
I know LAMP, you can program recorded audio. Snap and Core, I don't think you can, like TD Snap. I think Saltillo devices are better than Tobii devices for like kind of customizable, like recorded video and speech. So that's my personal preference, but yeah,
Thank you. I appreciate that.
of course.
Is there your question, Madeline?
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for coming this evening. I really appreciate your time. And thank you again, Megan, for a wonderful presentation. And we look forward to having you come back again and speak about more things all related to speech and language.
Of
So
course,
thank you so
yeah,
much.
anytime. Anytime. Thank
So
you,
very
thank you.
good. Very good.